Hi, Florian Birkmayer MD from AromaGnosis here, and today I want to talk to you about a theme that's been on my mind for a long time, and I realized I've never talked about it. So here goes, and it's really the statement on the mantra: "Hopelessness is a privilege I cannot afford." This phrase has come to me and again throughout the years, so I thought it was time to talk about it. I first heard this phrase from an acquaintance from Central America who both was a lifelong fighter for social justice, really devoted, and she also had very strong spiritual beliefs. And in my limited perspective, I've often learned that people who are very devoted to social justice causes are more on the materialist side of things, that they feel that their spiritual beliefs need to be ignored or not important or don't matter. Some even go so far as to say that religion is opium for the masses. So I admit this is a superficial dichotomy in my head, but I asked my friend, well, how do you reconcile your lifelong commitment to social justice with your genuine spiritual hunger? And she said, hopelessness is a privilege I cannot afford. And so that stuck with me ever since, and I've thought about it. And one way I think about it is that on the societal level, on the social level, on the cultural level, when we think about the social injustices and inequalities, they seem to be getting worse all the time. And similarly, when we think about human-caused climate change and climate catastrophe and its horrible impact on plant and animal species, when we really feel the pain and the anguish and that urgency that something has to be done, that we have to do something, what can be done, when this urgency becomes really loud and when we hear the cry of our own souls and of Mother Nature about all this imbalance and injustice, this can become overwhelming. It becomes almost too painful. And one of the reactions to that overwhelm is hopelessness. To say things like, well, there's nothing I can do, or what can little me do, or sometimes you hear it from other people, what are you going to do about it? And hopelessness is paralyzing, and it sort of gets us off the hook. At least that's what our ego convinces us of. But by some strange ego logic, there's no point to the soul urge to do something because nothing can be done. And that doesn't just apply to the big issues I talked about: social injustice and imbalance, the conflicts in the world, the climate catastrophe. It often happens when our soul says, you really got to do this in your life, and the ego says, well, there's all these reasons why that's not going to happen. It's inconvenient, it's hopeless, and that really kills the soul. And with this hopelessness, with this feeling that nothing can be done, comes a sense of complacency, of powerlessness, and those can be very pernicious. They allow us to step back from the painful edge of being aware of the suffering and the sense that something has to be done. But we really need that painful edge. We need to muster the courage, and in a way, that painful edge is the sign of the direction we need to go in. And that painful edge is also the doorway to the unconscious, and we need to allow the unconscious to come up and speak to us, and we need to listen. And that listening, I think, again, is through that painful edge. And there are other painful edges, or what I call ego defenses, where the ego is constantly coming up with different ways to defend against the demands of the unconscious. And I've talked about them in an earlier video. Now, this hopelessness can be thought of as a thought virus. Now, thought virus is a term originally coined by William Burroughs, and I like it a lot more. It's basically the original term before meme. Meme isn't just a cute picture of a cat going around the internet or social media. A meme is a self-replicating unit of thought, sort of like a virus is biologically, a meme is cognitively, culturally. And so I like the term thought virus because it reminds us that these things are autonomous and that they spread and they can infect us. And it's a thought that we can become infected with and that spreads throughout us and hides really from us, that we're not even aware we're infected with it, that the thought seems natural. Well, obviously hopelessness is the only, all these thought viruses, hopelessness is not the only thought virus. And also we can infect others with them the way we spread biological viruses. And I believe, and if you Google it, there was this wave of hopelessness some years ago about the fossil fuel industry, that nothing can be done about fossil fuels. And again, these news articles that you can find online showed that the fossil fuel companies really released these hopelessness memes, these hopelessness thought viruses into the media sphere, basically to weaken the opposition. With hopelessness comes complacency, comes a sense of, oh, there's nothing I can do. And it allowed the fossil fuel companies to keep going with business as usual, and not only not avoid the necessary shift away from them, but they've actually really thrived. They've had record profits in the last few years, I think in part through inoculating the resistance with hopelessness. And there's this, someone even said they made more money than God, which is a really offensive, weirdly capitalist term. Like, what does it matter how much money God made? Or is that the way of all measure? Again, it just shows you the whole worldview is suffused with this bizarre value system. But again, I think in no small part due to hopelessness, fossil fuel companies were able to paralyze the opposition and have had record-making profits. So ask yourself, have you been infected with hopelessness? We really can't afford hopelessness. Hopelessness is a privilege I or you cannot afford. And hopelessness often feels like the conclusion. Oh, it's hopeless. Nothing more to do, nothing more to think about it. But hopelessness is actually the beginning. It's that painful threshold we need to cross. But it has been spread as a virus, a weaponized virus, to stifle and numb us to the urgent demands of our soul, of our unconscious, and of the world's soul. Now, I've talked about the default mode network before, the network in our brain that constructs our story of ourselves in a nutshell, our ego story. This is who I think I am. And it also makes rapid judgments. I like this, I like that person, I don't like this, I don't like that. And so I jokingly have said that it was hacked by the person who developed the Facebook like button, knowingly or unknowingly, but it's really all social media. It's this program, oh, what's going on there? It installs itself, maybe it's there latently and it gets activated, and I think that's what's called, fear of missing out. It's this program in us where all of a sudden these things become so important that weren't important before, and we're not even aware how artificial this is, how we've been programmed by it. So that's, again, just to show how powerful the default mode network is. A, that it convinces us we spend all this time doing it, and it's hiding in plain sight. When we're driving to the store, when we're going to work, these journeys we take hundreds or thousands of times, we don't even know how we got there. But that's how we go through much of our life because of the default mode network. And I think that hopelessness is a program, or gets programmed into default mode network, and we don't even notice it. And the way I think of the programs in the default mode network, and again, there's depression, PTSD, anxiety, substance abuse, but also more subtle things like hopelessness or fear of missing out. It's this deep rut that we're in. And the rut, we're convinced by the default mode network, the rut is the whole world. Nothing else exists besides of it. There is no alternative. There is no world outside the rut. And that inherently we need to overcome. And we know that essential oils, aromas, and psychedelics can weaken or deactivate the default mode network, basically dissolve the internal connectedness and open it up more to other parts of ourselves, of the brain. We know that psychedelics and aromas really connect more of the brain. We become more reconnected to ourselves. We become more open. The doors to the unconscious become open. And I think I like the term ecodelic. We become more connected through awareness of the beings around us, of that we're part of this very complex and fragile system. But at the same time, the default mode network, and again, I think the ego is just a program, programs us to think nothing else exists. The rut we're in is the whole world. But, let's go back to the statement, hopelessness is a privilege I cannot afford. So hopelessness is also a privilege. Now, we've become aware of us, many of us, what privilege means in society recently, and how often when we're in a privileged position, and there are different privileged positions, we're too often blind to our privilege and the rather unique perspectives it gives us. It can feel like, oh, well, this is obviously the only way to look at it, or this is the better way or the right way. Those are all signs of privilege. And this applies to hopelessness as well. Hopelessness is often the trump card, if you will. It overrules all other concerns. So, and I think that hopelessness makes us blind, and privilege makes us blind. And like privilege, we can examine and let go of this blindness, this limited perspective. And I say privilege is an often unconscious choice, or something we're unconsciously programmed to take on, to assume, to look at the world through this lens. And I say choice, I know that's a problematic term when we're programmed unconsciously by something, when it's sort of been fed to us in all these different ways, but we still have a choice to stop. We still have a choice to question our privilege, to leave behind hopelessness. So that's why I use the word choice, that we have a choice to step out. And privilege and hopelessness also collaborate to overwhelm us in other ways. We might feel that the changes that need to be made to address the social injustices and the climate crisis demand things that we might be unwilling to make, or they're inconvenient to make. People might say, I like driving my fossil fuel-based car, I like eating meat, I like having access to all these products instantly, I like to live in a house that's got all these features that require being connected to the grid. And when we're attached to these things, and again, how did that even happen? Default mode network. We just sort of get inoculated. The iPad didn't exist, 20 years ago, and yet our lives were perfectly fine. So we all these objects take up space in our minds and our unconscious and create a fear of change. There are other forces at play that create this fear of change. And I have to say that I think the fear of change is false. I'm privileged to live in an earthship. It's off-grid, it's passive solar. We generate electricity from solar panels. We collect rainwater. We heat the water. We heat the whole house. And honestly, at this point, I wouldn't want to live in a conventional house, not because there's really nothing inconvenient about living like this. And the little things that in a conventional house might make you sort of worried, where's the electricity in the wall coming from? What's my carbon footprint? These little choices that I make constantly, open the blinds to make sure the room gets heated up, use hot water in a certain way. All these little things make me happy. So it's not a matter of having to leave behind these awful things, or leaving behind these things and having to do these awful things. I think change can be very liberating, inspiring, reinforcing. So I'm just saying that resistance to change, of I like things the way just they are, that might make us not want to change it, and then we use hopelessness sort of as an excuse. I think we need to question those. Now, when I Google hopelessness is a privilege I cannot afford, there's really not much out there, and I'm wondering if it's been edited out of the collective unconscious of the interwebs. Maybe that simple phrase is dangerous. To me, hopelessness is paralyzing. It's similar to that paralyzing stare of the Medusa, of the Death Mother. Like the Death Mother can paralyze us with one look. Hopelessness, in a way, is an outgrowth of that. It can happen in a relationship with a Death Mother within the family, but it's like larger forces in society that give you that look, and very quickly we're paralyzed like a Medusa stare into hopelessness. Like the Death Mother, hopelessness can paralyze us really with one look. Hopelessness is really sort of society. It's like the societal default mode network. It makes us blind to the opportunity, the necessity, and the really as yet unseen promises of the changes that we really need to make. So how can you let go of hopelessness? How can you prevent it from spreading? I think we need to be open to our unconscious. There's the term mindfulness, but it's really it's not a mindfulness, because the mind, again, is mostly the ego. It's a soulfulness, or an unconscious fullness. Just being open, and the way we recognize it, again, is through those thresholds, through those ego defenses, through that discomfort, that hopelessness is, nothing to see here, folks, forget about it. Working with essential oils, smelling aromas will really shift you out of the default mode network, will really disrupt that habitual thought pattern that you're in, that you don't even know you're in, and that makes you feel like it's the whole world. Connecting with nature, really going in nature, reconnecting, remembering, or really unforgetting that we're part of this beautiful, alive system that is urgently waiting for us to remember to take our rightful place in this beautiful network, to really have this soulful, embodied connection. Hopelessness is a privilege I cannot afford. To me, that's actually a really hopeful and inspiring mantra. And that's probably why it keeps coming back to me. What are your thoughts about hopelessness as a privilege I cannot afford? I'd love to hear them. Comment below, and I'll see you soon.